and fire service adaptations to a changing fire environment. And Marika and I had the opportunity to see this presentation a few months back, and what an amazing job, what an amazing presentation that Chief Nicholls did. So we asked him to bring it here so we could share it and record it and memorialize it. So this is what we're doing. So thank you, Chief Nicholls. Um, so with that said, I'm going to hand it over to you, Chief, and let you run the presentation. And when you're finished, we'll have some questions. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Roberta. Let me go ahead and share the screen here. Should be good there. Give me a thumbs up if you got it. All right, Marika says we're good. So back here. So the idea being is that obviously since 2017 here in Sonoma County, we've had more than our fair share of major wildland fires. And so there's a easy thought that, you know, what can we do? There's nothing we can do to prevent these fires and to prevent the damage and destruction that result from these fires. But rest assured that every fire that we've had since 17, our fire service leaders here in the county, both local agency, CAL FIRE, and all of the emergency services, law enforcement to Department of Emergency Management, have worked together to learn from lessons learned during each of these events and improve our operations for that next fire that's coming. So as kind of a background coming into this, if you look at the map, these are the recorded fires that we had, CAL FIRE, CDF back in the day, had from the time we started recording fires in the 1940s up into 1970. So as you can see, there's a decent footprint across the county. Those of you that aren't tracking on history, you would be quick to think that maybe that biggest perimeter in the middle of the picture here is the Tubbs fire. But it's not. It's the Hanley fire from 1964. And so we're going to talk about that more as we get deeper into the conversation, that, you know, we now understand that there are wind corridors where we have an alignment with those most critical burning conditions and the topography across the landscape that create the opportunities for these devastating fires that we're going to see in years to come. So this takes us from the 1940s to 1970, some fires up around Lake Sonoma in the northern part of the county, a lot of different logging operations going on at the time. But over the years, we don't have that much use on the landscape at that point. So those fires start to taper off. But you'll see some patterns out there on the coast where that coastal shelf out there, and surprisingly, the lower Russian River, some offshore type wind events in 1961, 1965 that created some fairly devastating fires at the time. So as we go forward in time here, we come into a period of time between those first recorded fires in the 40s, and now we take it all the way up to 2010. So while the map changed, it didn't change drastically, right? But now we've added the Creighton Ridge fire that in 1978 was a large damaging fire here in the county. We had the Nuns Canyon fire, which occurred the same time as the Hanley fire in 1964. And then a smattering of fires out farther east in the unit, but we're talking about Sonoma County today. So brace yourself as we go into the next slide, because now we come into 2020 fires up till 2020, and I'll own it right off the bat that those of you that are tracking on the map here notice that the Yardarm fire from the early 90s and the Myers fire, more recently attached to the lightning fires in 2020, are not on that map. So bear with me, I'm not a GIS person, and that was a layer that I was missing when I put this together. But as you can see, there was a drastic change, especially east of the county, but specifically on the east side of the county here, with major fires that we experienced from 17 through 2020, including obviously the Kincaid and the Glass that we added to the October fire siege of 2017. Oops, I went backwards. So 2017 changes the game here for us in Sonoma County. We here in Sonoma County experienced the fires that we so often associated with Southern California, with the Santa Ana winds that take place in Southern California. But here, over the night hours of Sunday the 8th, we get dropped into the deep end of the pool with conflagrations that we had not seen in the recent history. And it all began during the day of Sunday, October 8th, with 172 fires that were ignited across the northern part of the state and what we call North Ops. 172 fires spread out across all of those counties, and you see clusters, right? There's the fires around Redding. There's a lot of fires in between in the foothills there in the Sierra between Sacramento and Chico. And obviously, we are all well too aware of the fires that occurred here in Sonoma County. During that first 48 hours of those fires, during that time, 172 fires ignited. The St. Helena Emergency Command Center, which is our emergency command center for the Sonoma Lake Napa unit, received a little over 3,600 calls for service for all of the events that were unfolding across the unit. Of those 172 fires that ignited, 18 became major fires across the North State, and 6 of them were directly here in the Sonoma Lake Napa unit. During that siege, obviously, 8,920 structures were destroyed. And keep in mind, as we get deeper into the conversation, 736 were damaged. So almost 9,000 structures were destroyed. Just under 1,000 were damaged. And that speaks to the structure-to-structure ignition once you get a major conflagration where there's not enough fire engines to go around for the fires that are occurring. And unfortunately, as we're all well aware, 44 people lost lives during that event in Mendocino County, down here, Napa County, and elsewhere in the state. So the Tubbs fire is the fire that gets most of the focus. What you're seeing on the screen here, the brown perimeter, the brown area on the map is the footprint of the Tubbs fire. And each of those black dots inside the brown perimeter is a structure that was destroyed by that rapidly expanding fire. During that period of time, basically a little after 9 o'clock till midnight was what it took for that fire to get to Santa Rosa. And at the time, there was a conversation about the fact that it took 3 hours to burn the distance that it took 3 days to burn in 1964 during the Hanley fire. But I'll put to you here in the next slide that maybe we're not quite as drastically different as it was in 1964. But to a firefighter, if you had asked any of us prior to the Tubbs fire, if we would have been concerned about a second Hanley fire getting across Highway 101 into Coffey Park and or burning Kmart down, we would have to a person told you that no, that's not possible. We'll catch it before it gets on the west side of Highway 101. And that's the takeaway that I want to leave a lot of folks with today, is that the spotting potential ahead of these major fires, things that we identify as major landmarks, are not the case during those major conflagrations. And so it requires the fire service to be light and agile and able to quickly respond to different locations on the fire ground to affect the most impact with that rapidly expanding incident. And just the fun fact for you that basically during the height of the most significant spread of the fire was estimated to be traveling the length of a football field every minute. So 300 feet every minute was marching down the Mark West drainage. So some historical reference. There was the Great Fire in 1870. Nobody's got a great perimeter on that, but a lot of folks estimate that it burned a similar footprint, but I don't have a great example to use for you other than there's a historical reference to that fire event burning a similar footprint to what was the Hanley fire in 1964. But 64, we obviously have good record keeping of what that did. And so if you look at the map there, the red line is the Hanley fire in 64. And the black is obviously the Tubbs. I don't know if you can see my mouse on the map. Good. So the mouse location on the map is roughly the origin for the Tubbs fire in 2017. And so obviously the backstop here, the fire that went up Mount St. Helena, that wasn't until after the wind had subsided. So that first night, that fire left Bennett Lane and burned down the Mark West drainage to Santa Rosa. And then once the wind came off of it the next day, fire wants to go up, right? So it goes with topography. So at that point in time, the fire turned around 180 degrees and burned up Mount St. Helena. So if you'll notice, the red line is the Hanley fire. And unfortunately, I don't have the whole footprint for you here on this map, but the Hanley fire was actually farther over on the St. Helena Road on Highway 29, and it actually burned to the northeast for the first day of the fire, got influenced by the wind day 2 of the fire, which pushed it down to the valley floor. And it wasn't until that afternoon, late afternoon, some reports say 4 o'clock, some say 6 o'clock, that it spotted across Highway 128 and then did the exact same run to Santa Rosa that the Tubbs fire did in 2017. So while it wasn't quite 3 hours, it most definitely wasn't 3 days that it took to get to Santa Rosa. So those same wind factors were present, which drove that fire down the funnel, down the chute of the Mark West drainage into Santa Rosa proper. And at that point in time, the wind let up just as it came into Santa Rosa. And so it didn't get as established in the Santa Rosa plain as the Tubbs fire did in 2017. So for the lay of the land, the central complex. So the Tubbs fire was one of 6 major fires in the central complex, the LNU central complex. We had the Adobe fire in Kenwood that ended up burning together with the Nuns fire that was across from Glen Ellen. Several other fires, the Norbaum, were farther down into the Sonoma Valley. The Partrick actually came up and over from Napa County into the Nuns fire. So the Nuns was actually quite a few fires that burned together into one major fire. The Atlas fire over in Napa County, obviously, Chief Turbeville's fire up north, and then the fire that we don't really talk about is down at Sears Point, that basically, because it wasn't burning homes, was not part of the focus of the rest of the fire event. And so not only was there the fire up north, but there was also another fire in Lake County called the Sulphur Fire that in and itself, just west of Clear Lake on the peninsula out into the lake proper, destroyed 200 some odd homes. And because of the devastation of the rest of the fire event, very few people know about that sulfur fire today. So during the peak of the fire, during the 17 complex, we had over 1,000 fire engines on the fire, 180 bulldozers, just under, obviously, and 263 hand crews. The takeaway is that for 1,000 fire engines to assemble in Santa Rosa, that requires resources from not only across the state, but across the country, because even when we have a conflagration that requires the amount of resources that we need to bring to bear to combat that fire and contain it and ultimately extinguish it, all the local agencies that are producing resources to assist in that incident still have their day-to-day 911 calls that they have to answer, and they still have to protect their local municipalities and areas that they're coming from. So to get 1,000 extra fire engines, those resources came from 17 states, and ultimately not fire engines, but firefighters came from Australia to help us with the central complex during the 17 fires. So 2017, devastating event. We fought the fire as best we could, but the ultimate game was to get people out of harm's way, because the fire was moving so rapidly that the firefighters and firefighting resources that first night into the next day, the best thing that we could do, because when we show up to a fire event or any emergency event, our priorities are in order all the time: life, property, and the environment. So in this scenario, we had to get as many people out of the way of that rapidly advancing fire that we could, which meant that we weren't able to affect the perimeter control that we normally would have, because we had to address the life safety component before we could start fighting fire. So a lot of valuable lessons learned during the 17 fires. In 2019, October 2019, we're almost out of fire season, and at 9:32 at night during a wind event, we have the Kincaid fire that ignites up in the geyser steam field. Over the course of that night, it was a wind-driven fire, and it's this brown perimeter that you see on the map here that burned down into Geyserville proper and tried to get across the river into downtown Geyserville. We were given a break as that day went on, in that the wind let up, so it wasn't continuing to push to the east. But you'll notice that the different colors on the map are different periods of time during that fire event. So the Kincaid fire was unique in the fact that it was not one, not two, but three separate wind events by the time that that fire was over. And so while we had the first run down the hill into Geyserville proper, and a couple of days of lack of strong offshore winds to try to button up that fire, unfortunately, then the next wind event came, and that's the major run that you see on the 25th coming down into, the 27th, down into Healdsburg, Windsor, that created the evacuations that resulted from that fire. But this was a fire where the initial evacuations were the rural areas up above Geyserville, and so we were able to get those people out without issue. And as we rolled into the second wind event, the incident management team was already here at the fire. The operations were underway, and so the forecast, the weather forecasts, gave us the knowledge that that fire was not likely to stay within the containment lines that we had in place before it got wind checked by that next wind event. So that was what created the opportunity to use the legwork that Department of Emergency Management had begun post 17 to use the new evacuation zones to effect an orderly evacuation for Windsor and Healdsburg, and ultimately the north end of Santa Rosa, as that fire threatened those communities. And so the realization for those evacuations, that the trigger was pulled for those evacuations the night before communities were notified. And the idea being was that we didn't want to do a middle of the night evacuation that created extra panic and stress that didn't have to happen, because the wind event wasn't supposed to come in until that following evening. And so there was a tactical decision made to wait till we had daylight, wait till people were up and moving before we started that orderly evacuation process, to remove the people from closest to the fire to the farthest away from the fire, so that Highway 101 and the surrounding arterial roads could support that mass exodus of 180,000 people out of the way of that advancing fire. The thing that we learned during this process is that you can tell in this picture here that I have up on the screen, that's actually a map that's on an 8-foot by 8-foot table constructed at the incident base. We call that the war room, and that is where the evacuation coordination occurs, and then subsequently the repopulation deeper into the incident. So while the county had started the process for the evacuation zones, they weren't quite fleshed out yet. And so it was arts and crafts time for the law enforcement liaison officers and the team to be able to identify those zones in a manner of which we could communicate with resources on the ground. And so that next morning when we started down that road, the sheriff's office says, this is great, because obviously they're the agency having jurisdiction for evacuations. They said, this is great. We need a copy for the main for our briefing for all the allied agencies that are coming in to help us with this evacuation. And we looked at them and said, well, this is a one of a kind. This is Sharpie driven, and we don't have a copy to give you. So there were deputies in the war room trying to get cameras at a high enough elevation that they could stitch those pictures together back at the main. Obviously, that was not what we wanted to do, and so that was a takeaway from the 2019 fire, was bringing those evacuation zones down to the individual patrol vehicle, to the fire engine, to the chief officer, so that we're all on the same sheet of music and we all have access to the exact same evacuation zone data to be able to drive that organized, quick, and efficient evacuation process. So we get out of the 2019 fire season. Everybody wipes the sweat off their brow, and we come into 2020 and we make it all the way till August, and we get hit with the 2020 lightning series that created over 1,000 lightning strikes across Northern California. This is a representation of the strikes that were recorded in our general area. And of those strikes, 650 fires were ignited across the state. Here locally, those fires, the fires that were ignited, because we had many fires that were ignited here in the unit. In the early day, we were able to contain most of the fires out along the coast, down in the Petaluma Basin, and out in the Occidental area. However, the Walbridge fire, the Myers fire that's on this map, and obviously the Hennessy were fires that were unable to be extinguished before they became major fires. The Hennessy was a culmination of many different lightning strikes in and around the area between Lake Berryessa and Angwin, kind of St. Helena, but they all burned together and were known as the Hennessy fire. So here locally, the Walbridge fire was a big deal to us, right? Over 50,000 acres, structures destroyed, a major draw on resources. But here locally, those evacuation zones were already in place. So the sheriff's office, Captain Murphy, and I sat here at the incident command post in Santa Rosa and were able to get people out of the way of those advancing fires so that firefighters could focus on the firefighting operations that needed to take place. You'll notice that during the lightning fires, it's not during an offshore wind event. So where historically we have a fire running from northeast to southwest, the Walbridge fire was in alignment with the prevailing northwest wind during the bulk of the fire event. So it burned from the northwest to the southeast out into the area around Sweetwater Springs Road and West Side Road, which was a major concern that it wanted to continue that march back into the Santa Rosa Plain, Guerneville, Forestville, Hacienda. And so that was a complication with that process because we had the PSP that was underway at the time. And we needed to make sure that we communicated with folks before they lost power and lost access to their alert and warning devices that would allow them to get out of the way. And with the Walbridge, we didn't have the same road infrastructure to get people out of harm's way. Highway 101 and 116 are not created equal. And so we had to take that into account for that reflex time to get people out of harm's way. But this was another example where we didn't have a Tubbs type fire where it burned the area that it burned in 3 hours. We had that opportunity to forecast where that fire was going to go and therefore drive the people out from in front of that fire so that, again, firefighters could focus on perimeter control and saving structures where they could. You'll notice that similar to the sulfur fire in 17, I'm not sure that there's a lot of people that understood that the Woodward fire was occurring at the same time down on the Point Reyes Peninsula, very similar to in size to the fire in 95 down there that was a major fire at the time, but because it was during the complex, during the lightning series, it was a fire that didn't get a lot of fanfare. I'll leave you with the fact that the Walbridge fire, when you look at the map here, and obviously Santa Clara unit and San Mateo Santa Cruz unit were also a part of major fires that were impacting those units. But the Walbridge fire during the initial days of the firefight was the priority fire for the state. Even though it wasn't the largest fire, it had the most room to impact communities and create devastation across the board. And so while we got all the resources, we not all the resources, while we were the priority to get the resources that were available, hand crews, reflex time for bringing crews in from out of the state, because obviously there's a reduction in firefighter crews here in the state. We had all the bulldozers we could want and then some, but we weren't able to use those hand crews to connect that country that the bulldozers couldn't get through. And so the fire continued to give us fits and starts working down into the Dry Creek Valley because we couldn't close the door on those steep drainages that were in alignment with the prevailing winds pushing that fire down into the valley. Luckily, towards the tail end of the incident, those resources were brought to bear and we were able to close those gaps and contain that fire. But it was something that early on, Chief Turbeville and I are really trying to make sure that we get as many shaded fuel breaks here in the county as possible, so that we have that pre-fire work in place so that when those future fire events come, we have the ability to quickly close the door on those fires without a major influx of hand crew support that more than likely is not going to come when you have multiple fires burning across the state. So we get through we thought we were through the height of the 2020 fire season. And unfortunately, the tail end of September, during yet another wind event, the glass fire occurred. So in the early hours of the 27th of September, the glass fire ignites on the east side of the Napa Valley. And that's important because everybody, I'm sure, on this call is familiar with it, with what it looks like in between Calistoga and St. Helena there in the Napa Valley. So when you're talking about fuel breaks and an opportunity to stop a fire, that's very similar to and above and beyond what 101 would have done for Coffey Park. This was the epitome of what was a fire break that, you know, a lot of people would have held their breath anticipating that was going to hold the fire. And through the bulk of the 27th, it did. Unfortunately, that evening, it got onto this ridge down in the middle of the valley proper and created spot fires, two of which, one was just inside the Sonoma County line and one was just on the St. Helena side of the line. And those were the fires that burned into, those spot fires were a continuation of the glass fire that ultimately burned down into the Santa Rosa Plain, into Rankin Valley, Oakmont, and Kenwood. And ultimately tried to get through Annandale, but again, we were given a break when the wind stopped blowing and we were able to contain that fire before it continued through the backside of the park. Chief Turbeville was up there on the county line that night doing good work on that second spot fire, or the westernmost spot fire that I've indicated. And they were anticipating to be able to hold St. Helena Road. So we would have been able to contain that fire on the south side of St. Helena Road with the idea of bringing it to Calistoga Road and then down into Rankin Valley proper. Unfortunately, As we work our way back up towards the heel of the fire, what had happened is as the day had progressed, that fire had continued to burn up the valley towards Calistoga. And the early hours of the next morning, it was able to find just enough receptive fuel to burn through the valley floor. And then it got onto that east aspect slope, which was in alignment with the wind, which created a devastating second head that ran down into the backside of St. Helena Road. And that was the fire event that impacted Monon's Rill and those surrounding areas due to that second finger of the fire that came across the valley floor and ultimately into the remainder of the footprint. So as you can see, the colors on this map again will guide us through the area burned from the beginning of the fire till the fire was ultimately contained. So shades of the Tubbs fire, you had these long, narrow runs that were what occurred during the offshore wind event, during that critical fire weather. And then once that initial run was done, the wind stopped blowing. We did experience a second wind event during that fire, but we were able to hold the control lines that we had for the most part. And that is the portion that you see here on the south side where it continued to kind of chunk along the county line break between St. Helena and Glen Ellen. But as that fire event had unfolded, obviously we had a lot of line to construct and a lot of structures to defend and ultimately extinguish with that first run. And so that allowed the fire, if you look here in the top right corner of your screen, the fire then continued back up the other side of the Napa Valley up into Lake County because it then became a slope-driven fire in steep, nasty terrain that it took our resources a while to get around. Oh, I'm sorry, that was the finger that I was telling you about coming up just to the south of Diamond Mountain, up and over into the backside of Gates and Monon's Rill. So some major devastation from 17 through 20. But the thing I want to leave you with this slide here is that in 17, just on the Tubbs fire by itself, there were 24 fatalities, obviously just under 40,000 acres burned, 5,600 structures destroyed, and 317 damaged. The Kincaid gave us an opportunity with that early warning, the updates to early warning, the updates to evacuation zones, 0 fatalities. It is the largest fire in county history, but no fatalities and 374 structures destroyed during that event. 60 damaged, but when you run the percentages between the two, that shows you that fire engines had more of an opportunity to get in for that structure defense than we experienced in 2017 due to the overwhelming of resources with those multiple major fires, not only across the county and the unit, but also the state as a whole. By the time we get into the Walbridge fire, again, no fatalities, a major fire at 57,000 acres. But now look at your numbers, 157 structures destroyed. And I'll caution you, or I'll own it, that it's sad to talk about that that's a win, because that's still 157 homes that have been destroyed. But compared to those prior fire events, that's night and day, right? But the takeaway on this one is 157 destroyed and 135 damaged. So it was the ability to surge in resources, to bring those resources to bear at those most critical spots to limit the loss of property, because we've already limited the loss of life because we've gotten everybody out of the way. Now we were able to focus on that property preservation and ultimately the perimeter control to go with that. And so as we come into it, the Glass Shady. So the Shady was the spot fire into Sonoma County, because at the time it was roughly 3 miles away from the closest point of the Glass fire when it occurred. Again, across the fire service, prior to these last several years, if you had talked to a firefighter about a spot fire being able to ignite 3 miles ahead of the main body of the fire to a person. Matter of fact, one of my mentors called me during the fire and said, Ben, I can't get there. That's too far out for that to be a spot fire. And he's very academic, and so we parted ways, and obviously I was a little busy at the time, and so a day or two later things had kind of slowed down a little bit, and he called me up and he said, Ben, I got to own it that I've done some research, and in Australia they've already documented in their recent fire events that they've had spotting in upwards of 3 miles in front of the main body of the fire. So that is something that is modern occurrence that we're dealing with, that historically, due to drought conditions and the wind events we've experienced with the ignitions in the wrong place on the wrong day, it creates those opportunities for those very long range spotting opportunities. And so the idea I want to leave you with is that shaded fuel breaks are important where the fire gives us that opportunity. If it gives us a mile, we're going to take a mile. If it gives us an inch, we'll take that inch, because we're not going to get it back. We've got that opportunity for a moment in time, and if we don't take advantage of that point in time, then we've lost it for the next deal. So that proactive fuels work that we can do to set that battlefield for success gives us the opportunity to limit the destruction that we've seen in these last several years. And then I don't have the damage off the top of my head, but during the glass fire, the ability to recognize where the fire was going. So 2017, there were no nighttime CAL FIRE resources over the fire. Henry 1 had a couple hours, or had a brief moment in time in the early morning hours to do a flight. But it was 2019 forward where we basically have what we call a night air attack. And it's similar to the day air attack that's running the air tanker show during the daytime, but they're flying at a much higher altitude for safety concerns. And that gentleman that was flying in that plane that night was able to tell us with certainty that fire was going to be into Santa Rosa in 2 hours. And so based off of that information and the intelligence gathered from the alert wildfire cameras and obviously fire history that we had experienced, that allowed us to surge resources into Rincon Valley, Melita, Oakmont, to be able to anchor and hold in those communities and meet that fire front as it arrived in those neighborhoods to help defend those structures from that potential of ignition, structure to structure ignition, and losing entire neighborhoods. So that was a huge difference in 2020 versus what we had experienced in 17. I can't see the chat. I was gonna, if there was any pressing questions, I'd be happy to answer those, because we're kind of moving into improvements. But again, I can't see it on my screen.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, Chief.
Okay.
Came up that I pulled out of the chat. So, um, one that is more of a logistics kind of a thing. Can you make these slides available, maybe as a PDF that we can share with folks?
Huh?
The slideshow. Okay, perfect. So if anybody wants those, just shoot us an email, and we'll see if we can pass those along to you all. And then you kind of spoke to this a little bit, and when you said this, when you started talking about fuel breaks, I thought, oh my gosh, he's pulling it right out of chat. But it's just more of a coincidence. So one of the questions is, how effective are shaded fuel breaks, or really, in my opinion, any breaks, in a severely wind-driven fire? And in that case, is a shaded fuel break more or less of a better break than a bona fide fire break, regular fire break, where it's not shaded at all?
Great question. I think that's probably about 3 parts to it, but so a shaded fuel break. So those of you in the crowd that are up on history are familiar with the Maginot Line, that the French expended a whole lot of resources prior to World War II building a defensive line that was going to be impenetrable to the German army for a subsequent action from World War I. The Germans just went around it. And so that's the cautionary tale I have for you for fuel breaks, is that they're not the panacea. They're not the solution to the problem. They're a solution to the problem. They're a proactive approach that we can take that, again, during the right conditions, that fuel break already constructed will allow the limited firefighting resources that are here present in the county when that fire first takes off to be able to contain that fire before it impacts surrounding areas. So fuel breaks by themselves are not going to solve all of our problems, but they are a valuable tool across the board. And so the difference between a shaded fuel break and a fire break or a fuel break is that in a traditional fuel break or fire break, you're removing every stitch of vegetation in that break. That is not ecologically sound, and it's a maintenance nightmare. So the thing that I make sure to leave with everybody I talk to is that fire is part of the California landscape. We have the landscape we have because of the fire history here in California. So there is such a good thing as good fire, and we need to implement that when and where we can. And we're rapidly expanding that scale and pace throughout Sonoma County and ultimately throughout the state, because I will put out there to you that during the Walbridge fire, where you have areas of severe impact from that fire event that will take a generation or two to get back to what it was before, as a whole, that fire burning almost in the peak of fire season did nothing but good. Coming down into Armstrong Woods, and into the shores of Lake Sonoma, it was a low intensity backing fire down into these areas that reduce the deadened down component, which makes a healthier environment and helps prevent future catastrophic fires. So fuel breaks are best set up, and the way I look at them here in the county is that they're the beginning. We have to start somewhere. We've got this elephant sitting in front of us, and if we don't start taking bites, we're never going to get through it, right? But we have to start somewhere. And so those fuel breaks help during fire operations here in the future, but they also become the sides of the box for future prescribed fire. And so that's the piece of the puzzle where we're looking for those ridge tops so that we can start compartmentalizing those areas in the watersheds so that we can create a more resilient environment, and we can hopefully prevent some of the catastrophic fire damage that we've seen here in the years past.
Yeah, and I think too, Chief, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm a pavement princess, not a wildland person. But the field breaks also, well, 98% roughly of the fires that do occur from whatever cause get held to small acreage and don't get to the size of the catastrophic fires we've seen lately. And so it seems to me too that with strategically placed field breaks, we can help kind of get ahead of the clock in those circumstances and keep those fires small long enough to get the resources on there to quash those guys out before they get that big.
Yeah, and again, we've got the Blue Ridge crew that's now here at the Hood Mountain Fire Center. They're still not a permanently funded crew, but we have one hand crew here in Sonoma County. So when we have a major fire, we're looking for 20, 30, maybe 100 crews by the time that fire becomes a major fire. Across the state, and that's a different conversation, but across the state, our hand crew numbers have taken a nosedive with our historic California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation inmate hand crews. And so we're still trying to fill that void as an agency, but that's a heavy lift. And so whereas historically we had more access to hand crews, in 2022 we don't. And so it's that pre-fire work that would be doing exactly what we would be doing during the height of firefighting operations that helps the reduced number of resources maximize that containment potential and be able to extinguish that fire.
Yeah. Speaking of that, can you speak to the limitation of hand crews now compared to years past? That actually was a question I wrote down to ask you about. You kind of alluded to it, but when you did the presentation before, I was shocked at and concerned because, you know, in the slide you showed earlier, it was like 60 some hand crews on the fire, but now I don't think, from what I understand, we don't have that kind of resource available anymore.
Yeah, so during 17, the 263 hand crews, some of those were from out of state, right? So we had Forest Service hotshot crews, we had crews, I believe, from the Nevada Division of Forestry. We had crews from outside of the state as well as in the state. So we are sitting at about half. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but basically half of what we had in the early 2000s, and the Forest Service has seen significant impacts to their hand crew strength as well. So we didn't have enough hand crews historically to go around anyway, and so those sort of reductions are a major impact to firefighting operations when we're trying to prioritize fire to assign those crews to, and where we can make the most impact with the crews that we have.
Right. Um, let's see, a couple more questions. And I think I know the answer to this one. I think we can these days. But the question is, can CAL FIRE reasonably predict where fires will run? And is CAL FIRE doing prescribed burning, preceded by thinning as necessary, of course, in those areas? And I think it's yes and yes, right?
Yeah, so one of the tools I'm going to talk about here a little bit deeper into the conversation is a company called Techno Silva that gives the ability for firefighting personnel to run a simulation on where that fire wants to go at time of dispatch. So basically, it takes the information from our computer-aided dispatch, puts it on a pin on the map, and bases it off of current weather conditions and the surrounding fuels, and gives us not only where the fire is going to go, but the structures impacted by that fire as that fire progresses. And so that definitely gives us a unique tool that we did not have in 17 coming into those fires. Not that modeling would have changed anything on those fires, but it allows us, again, when we're talking about a finite amount of resources locally that can be brought to bear in those first couple hours of the fire, where are they going to make the most impact and where's the most threat?
Yeah.
And then the prescribed fire component, yes. So my focus prior to post 17 has been, we're going to have Walbridge type fires, right? We will have major fires that are not necessarily the offshore wind event fires. But when we're talking about loss of life and property, it's those wind event fires that are going to have the most potential for devastating consequences to those fires. So windward side of our population bases here in the county are my priorities to treatment, and especially on the east side, where we now have multiple fire events that almost have the same final line when they're said and done, which shows us that correlation to the topography in alignment with the winds, the most critical fire weather winds that we have at those points when those fires have occurred. So Chief Tuberville has been busy helping his CAL FIRE partners up in the Mark West drainage, burning at Pepperwood, because Pepperwood has been a piece of land that has experienced not only the Tubbs fire, but the Kincaid, and was able to be used to try to keep the Kincaid out of the Mark West drainage. And so it's a strategically valuable piece of property that basically extends from Chalk Hill Road down to Porter Creek, where we pick up the new Mark West Regional Park. to Foothill subdivision, to Barham Peak, over to Calistoga Road at Plum Ranch Road, that runs us across the top of the ridge to Los Alamos, where we pick up then Hood Mountain into Sugarloaf and tie into work that's being done with Napa Firewise and Cal Fire from Trinity Road to Bald Mountain. So it's those strategic ridgetop fuel breaks supported by prescribed fire that allows us to maximize the resources we have when we have those fire events.
Perfect. All right, thanks. I have a couple more questions in the queue. I'm going to hold those for later. Let's finish the presentation or get further along because I'm looking at the clock. We're starting to run a little long, but that's okay. No
All
rush.
right, I'll pick up the pace here. So about halfway through. So we've got all these lessons learned. We bring that forward into future fire events. And so we have early detection, we have improved alert warning, we have cooperation and collaboration. That is one of the major success stories to me for our partners across the board, be it law enforcement, EMS, DEM, the NGOs here in the county. The collaboration that the county has come together with since 2017 has been amazing. And that's made a huge difference in the fire events we've had since then. Operational enhancements, and then obviously community engagement. So early detection. So Sonoma Water had started this process before it became a thing, but they brought Alert Wildfire to Sonoma County. They were the champions of bringing this in. They brought the first 6 cameras in, and obviously everybody on the call today, I'm sure, is well aware that it has exploded in its capabilities and the situational awareness that it brings not only to the fire community, because there were fire cameras in the past, but it would go to a monitor and a location and benefit a specific group that then tried to share that information with the rest of the world. The benefit about Alert Wildfire was everybody gets the same information. So you as a landowner, as a resident, as an entity threatened by a fire, you have the same exact information that the fire service has, because obviously the fire service is using those cameras to monitor that fire behavior. It's a decision support tool. It's not a decision make tool. And so as we go into developing that program in the top, I'm sorry, not the top right. So we have these cameras that have been brought online. And then more recently, DEM got a grant, a federal grant, to bring artificial intelligence to the existing Alert Wildfire cameras. And this artificial intelligence is to detect that early fire before it gets a chance to become a major fire and well established in the area that it's burning. It's been a great tool, again, for situational awareness. Here in Sonoma County, it's been in place for a little over a year now. The old Mark I eyeball beats cameras 9 times out of 10. So 99% of fires in a normal year here in the county are created by humans, started by humans, whether it's malicious or accidental. Humans and human activity is what creates fires. So 9 times out of 10, there are people close by because it's a built environment where the person was responsible for starting the fire, a vehicle, in this case, along Highway 101. So the person watches the fire start and they're on the phone to 911 within seconds, right? The alert artificial intelligence has to identify a column of smoke before it alerts dispatchers of a new fire. It's a tool in the toolbox for the more remote areas where we don't have as many people, and we have an opportunity for fires to maybe burn undetected for a little bit more of time. So it's another tool in the toolbox, but similar to the fuel breaks, it's not a one and done and solved all of our problems, because humans, as a rule, are quicker on the draw to 911 than the camera on a remote mountaintop. The county, the local agencies here in the county, and we have participated that as an agency as well, since 2017 have brought tablet command online, which shares information across the board, not only where vehicles are, resources, but also the details on the call. So chief officers down to engine company personnel have the ability to see every call in the county. On the map there, the red dots or the little red call out buttons are the incidents that are reflected on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see the resources that are assigned to those calls. And then with that rapidly expanding incident, it shows those first responders where their surrounding resources are, so that if there's a mayday or there's a resource need on a portion of the fire, they can see those local resources and be able to reach out to them and have that real-time communication to be able to break the fog of war. Because in 2017, middle of the night, darkness was our enemy, right? And so we weren't able to see the entire fire because the alert wildfire cameras weren't up, no night flying air attack, and we didn't have things like tablet command and tactical analysts that I'll show you here in a second that helps provide more information down to that firefighter on the ground. Brings us into the state-sponsored tactical analyst. This is the fire simulation. This program has many tools, one of which is the simulation capacity that shows us what that fire wants to do. But similar to tablet command, it shows where the state resources are, the incidents that are in the area, and all sorts of different layers with the alert wildfire cameras that we can link to directly from there to be able to get that situational awareness, as well as the fire modeling that program brings us. And then to alert and warning. So DEM has completely readdressed the alert and warning in the county. And so the alert and warning of 2022, now it's a matter of myself or the incident commander, if Chief Tuberville's got a fire out on the river, that person identifies the evacuation zone that needs to be alerted and evacuated, and that gets pushed instantaneously to Department of Emergency Management, Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, or Santa Rosa PD if it's a local agency deal. In this case, we're showing you the footprint of the city of Santa Rosa and their evacuation zones. And so all those different alerting tools, SoCo Alert, the high-low sirens, that was something that was unique to 17, is that we all get used to the day-to-day siren noise, but that European high-low siren that we don't use normally here in the United States became the tool to indicate to the general public that something's different. You need to perk up and figure out what's going on, and more than likely that means it's time to go. Nicholls and other social media platforms. Now we obviously have there's the Alert Wildfire app that shares information from across the agencies out to the general public and provides that information real time. Perimeter app is a new one that's working its way out. So there's all sorts of new information sources, not just for the fire service and emergency services, but also for the general public. So there's pre-designated evacuation zones. You can see here on the map, when the fires got established, the spot fires during the glass fire, I was able to make a phone call from St. Helena to my sheriff's office counterpart to tell him in real time that the 2 Queen 1 and 3 Henry 1 needed to be evacuated right now. And that's something that historically we didn't have to share back and forth. He was able then to communicate that with his deputies. DEM was able to load 2 Queen 1 and 3 Henry 1 and launch it. Because historically, what we would have done with the lack of pre-designated evacuation zones is that the incident commander may have said north of Hood Mountain Regional Park, west of the county line, east of Calistoga Road, and south of St. Helena Road. Well, that takes time to enter that those directions, those landmarks into a computer, And in 2022, not only does it need to be in English, but it needs to be in Spanish and perhaps other languages as well. So now with those pre-identified evacuation zones, that verbiage, Chief Tuberville and his partner at the time, Chief Van Warmer, were able to help the sheriff's office pre-identify those east of, west of, south of, north of boundary lines, so that now Sam Wallace or Jorge Rodriguez enter 2 Queen 1, 3 Henry 1, they push a button and it goes to the world in multiple languages, and it's done, as opposed to the historic reflex time that it took to enter those directions into the system. So fire service modifications for lessons learned forward from 17. The local agencies here in the county, similar to ourselves, historically we had staffing patterns where we held everybody on duty, but across the state, local agencies are bringing on extra personnel to, again, stage for those major events, so that we have more resources available ready to go in the event of a rapidly expanding incident. And the Office of Emergency Services funded that to be able to provide resources to those agencies so they can actually do that. And then the county all-call was something that came forward from 17, that when things are going sideways and there's never going to be enough resources, but we need every single resource we can get, Redcom, the dispatch center for Sonoma County, has the ability to hit a button and it tones out every single fire agency in the county, and it's the county all-call that summons all those resources to the incident. That's been modified over the years because in 2019, that creates a wave. All of a sudden there's 50 some odd pieces of fire equipment at the Luther Burbank Center, and now you have to plug them in so that they're effective in the firefighting operation. So that while that has been kind of stair-stepped up on that's still an ultimate option at the top end of the all-call, but there's a more measured approach to bring resources to bear on a fire that may or may not be that Tubbs type fire. And then obviously that critical pre-fire work to help Cara Leone and company get the community wildfire protection plan updated for the county, so that we can do that critical proactive work that needs to be done prior to those future events. So not to bring you back into 17 and the loss, but the item I want you to take away from these pictures is that while the neighborhood is gone, the vegetation across the board, other than the ones that were hanging over a house, are still intact. And so while we had that catastrophic fast moving fire, the devastation was that structure that started in the neighborhood, and then due to the proximity of the surrounding structures, created a domino effect that then marched out across the neighborhood. And so while you have one-offs where a home, for whatever reason, was able to withstand the onslaught, there were probably a lot of homes that had their defensible space and had that home hardening done, but it was their neighbor. So it's the weakest link in your neighborhood that is the threat to your neighborhood. And so you have to work together as neighbors to make sure that everybody is ready for that future event, because in those catastrophic conflagrations that we've experienced, there's not enough fire engines to go around. And so once that first house goes, that one house, even if everybody else was good to go, that one house could be the house that burns down the neighborhood. So it's absolutely critical that you maintain your defensible space, and ultimately that where you can, you work on hardening your home so that you prevent that ember cast ignition. I've had all sorts of scenarios, especially during the glass, where a kitty litter bag that didn't quite make it to the garbage almost burned down a house. A natural fiber doormat in front of a front door almost burned down a house. Other houses it probably did, but I was able to find homes that actually had survived that could have easily been just another statistic, but for whatever reason, that fire didn't quite get fully established and didn't take the house. So it's not necessarily all expensive things with hardy board siding and metal roofs. It's as simple as basic maintenance around the exterior house to remove those flammable things. And it doesn't have to be natural vegetation. It doesn't have to be ornamental vegetation. It can be the bag of kitty litter. It can be the bag of recyclables that didn't get out to the street yet. It's just that whole laundry list of things that when there's the red flag warnings that occur, that's your time to take stock around your house to make sure that you've got your home prepared for that future, or for that rapidly expanding incident, that there may or may not be firefighters there at the time when that ember catches the house on fire. Oh, we don't need the video. And I'll leave you with the glass fire because Fire Marshal Lowenthal got some great pictures of some of the factors that lead into structure loss. And so you'll see here that the vegetation on the slope, there wasn't a good break between the surrounding vegetation and the homes. And so this is an example where an east aspect, as the fire came down the ridge line into Skyhawk, then got into the bottom of this drainage and had a slope wind alignment and went right through the vegetation up into the house and then dominoed out from that initial house. Luckily, the firefighters were able to make a stop before it got through the entire neighborhood, but there were homes that were lost because one home hadn't made that break between that vegetation and their house. Another great example on the other side of that drainage, where the homeowners on the right had done their defensible space, no fuel here, right? That's not necessarily the best scenario for ecological standpoints. This house had a ground cover, but it was a heavier wood chip. This house over here on the far, not the far left, but the most damaged home had a yard full of gorilla hair fiber bark. And so that lightweight material is a perfect bird's nest for that ember cast out in front of the main body of the fire. And that's what allowed that fire to get into that house and almost burn down the house next to it on the left. They were able to save this house. They were able to prevent it from completely burning down, but obviously it almost burned down their neighbor's house as well. And then just a close-up view of that yard that allowed that fire to get up into the house. This was another one at the bottom of the drainage that, again, with a slope alignment through the vegetation, it was able to get into this house and unfortunately destroy that house as well. So moral of the story, please, we're working on the landscape level and the macro view, but we need the help from the landowners immediately surrounding their homes to help create that defensible space and ultimately the home hardening that will allow firefighters to be successful in defending your home. With that, I'll open it up to the crowd.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So folks, just let's see. A couple questions I'll start in the chat. And then if you guys want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And then Mason and Marika and I will kind of field those. So it looks like, let's see, somebody says, Stuart Mitchell says, although hardening every home in a neighborhood is ideal, some people may conclude, why do mine if others don't do theirs? Clarification on that. In my opinion, and I say this in a lot of presentations and a lot of venues, it's all about risk reduction. You know, you do what you can where you can and reduce the risk. The more you reduce that risk, the more the chances you're going to come back to something after you return from an evacuation. If you want to add to that, Chief, please feel free.
Yeah, so Stuart, it's one of those things that not every neighbor has the same capacity. So during some of the subsequent wind events that haven't resulted in major fires, I've done my part to go to some of my older neighbors to make sure that I could get up on there, ask them obviously, but I got up on the roof to clear out their gutters and to clear out the stuff around the backside of their house with the idea that it's that weakest link in the neighborhood. And I'm not going to be there when the fire impacts the neighborhood. And so everything I can do proactively before that fire impacts the neighborhood, So that the better I can stay focused on the firefight at hand and know that to Roberta's point, I have a better chance of coming home to something when the smoke clears.
Yeah, and then also you kind of alluded to something there, but can you give us the definition of defensible space, right?
For me, yeah. So the
Yeah,
defensible
yeah.
space, you're creating a break around your home that allows hopefully that fire to go around your house rather than through it. And so we're not looking for moonscape. We're not looking for a concrete pad that extends 300 foot in all directions around your house. We need you to break that fuel continuity from the natural environment into your home. So as you work your way out from the home, that becomes less and less. So in the 0 to 5 feet, the recommendation and ultimately direction with new laws coming into play will be no flammable material within 0 to 5. From 5 to 30, we used to call it the lean and green zone. Not a lot of green anymore. So now it's just the lean zone, but we want to make sure that all the grass is mowed down to less than 4 inches in height. We want wood piles outside of that 30-foot distance. We want to clear out from underneath the propane tanks so that less opportunity for flame impingement on the home and surrounding areas. And then as we get out into the 30 to 100 feet, again, we're not clear cutting. We're not making a moonscape. We're trying to reduce that dead and down fuel. We're reducing the ladder fuels so that a fire on the ground stays on the ground rather than getting up into the tops of the trees, because flame lengths, you can roughly calculate how tall most flame lengths will be by 1.5 times the height of the available fuel. So obviously you can do the math real quick that with the 40-foot tree, that's going to create a much different scenario for firefighters trying to defend that home than 4 inches of grass. So that's the ask out to that 100 feet. And then for the state standards, obviously that's 100 feet or the property line, whichever is closer. 13A addresses that and pushes it a little bit deeper onto the neighbor's property. But whatever defensible space you can get only benefits your home in that future fire event.
Yeah, I don't think I set that up well enough. So, um, I think the phrase defensible space was coined like decades ago, such that the defense in defensible space means it gives firefighters a spot to defend a fire coming toward your house so that firefighters don't have to spend a lot of time there. They can drive down a road, or strike team or individual resource can go through a neighborhood and just knock stuff down, whether it's in front of the fire front or even fire front following. They can put out those little fires if the defensible space is well created and well maintained. It's creating a defensible area where firefighters can defend that built environment, your homes. And it's evolved to a lot more currently with all the, science and effort folks have been putting into it to where, it's all about risk reduction too. But is that fair to say that that's kind of where it came from, I think.
Right. No, and in a perfect scenario, if you've done your defensible space and you've got the home hardening in place, there's a perfect opportunity that you may not even need a fire engine at that house. And so that's the deal, is that historically in a neighborhood, in a closely spaced neighborhood with a higher density of homes, the rule of thumb was one engine per 2 homes. Well, when we've got that rapidly expanding incident here in the county and we have a subdivision like Fountain Grove or Camp Meeker or Hacienda, Rio Neato, that are threatened by fire, we run out of fire engines long before we run out of homes to protect, to defend. And that's not taking into account perimeter control. So the more resources we can focus on perimeter control, the less damaging that fire is going to be, because we're going to be able to contain that fire before it becomes a major fire.
Right, perfect. We have about 7 minutes left. So I kind of want to start wrapping up. But there were a couple questions I held over from before about fuel breaks. And um, one of the questions is, are fuel breaks generally situated based on science or citizen concerns in politics? I'm going to take a crack at that first. Um, the my belief and understanding, having been a firefighter and fire marshal and closely integrated with fire folks, is that the field breaks where they are imagined to be ideally is based on science. It's based on fields. It's based on geography. It's based on topography. And field loading of the vegetation. Now, the funding that gets pointed towards making those field breaks happen can be influenced by politics and citizens, concerns, etc. Do you want to elaborate on that, or tell me if I kind of got that wrong or right, or however?
I would put to you that science drives the main body of that conversation for sure for the Cal Fire grants, because when those grants get submitted, the first question that gets asked is, did that grantee reach out to the unit to vet out their proposal? And if the answer is no, they've lost some major points for that process because they haven't tied in with the professionals. We've had some great examples here in the county. There's a great success story out in Hacienda, or not Hacienda, Rio Nido, where the community wanted to put in a fuel break to protect their community. But they did it without reaching out to the fire service, and working with Kim Batchelder and Ag and Open Space, we were able to adjust that project to get it back up onto the ridge lines. Because when we're talking about a fuel break mid slope, especially in a timber area such as Rio Nido, you have a fuel break that does not stand a good chance of holding, because the amount of rollout material, of burning material above that line, or if you actually have a fire coming out of Rio Nido to the surrounding areas, firefighters, it is very dangerous and more times than not, very unsuccessful to try to hold a mid-slope road from a fire below. It's a very dangerous operation, and it's not an effective use of resources. So while there can be public pressure from times to put a fuel break in a certain location, to date, that's kind of held out with the science from myself and other agencies to be able to make the most appropriate use of those resources.
And this will be the last question, and then we'll wrap up. And I think I know the answer to this one, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to toss it to you, Chief. Are there opportunities in your unit to let wildfires burn to reduce fuel loading?
No. The answer is no. Some of our federal partners have unfortunately a lot of experiences with a fire that at the time may be in a remote area and doing nothing but good. But when you're talking about a watershed type fire where you're trying to bring it out to ridge lines, if you're letting that fire burn for days or weeks on end before it reaches that ultimate final control line, weather conditions routinely change from what they are today versus a day or weeks from today. And so what seemed like a good plan on day one of the fire, day 14, weather conditions change, and now it goes right over the top of that ridge and burns into a community or burns into a much more difficult firefighting situation. So while our federal counterparts are the land managers for the land that the fire is burning on, the land that we protect is your land. It's private property, and it's not the state of California's land to make that choice. But what I will put to you is that while we are still going to aggressively assault wildland fires so that we limit the loss of life, property, and the environment, we're going to do everything in our power to bring that good fire to the landscape outside of the wildfire event to make a more resilient environment and to help protect our neighbors and communities from those future fire events.
Great. All right. Well,
Roberta, can I jump in quickly? Because I think it would be important for everyone and for the recording to hear our unit chief talk about the strict law of the 0 to 5 and how strict that is. It just seems to be something that comes up a lot for people right now. So just yeah, how is that being enforced? Is it going to be enforced? How is that taking shape? How strict is that 0 to 5? Can there be brush in that area? Can
Oh,
there be different species trees in that area? Would you mind just addressing that? I think that would be good for our recording.
okay, I came up at a presentation last night as well. Chief Nichols, you want to kind of handle that in the last couple minutes?
Oh man, Marika. So 4291, Public Resources Code 4291 is being updated to address that 0 to 5. And the letter of the law says no flammable material within that 0 to 5 distance. So it was targeted towards, say, like a rosemary or a decadent type plant in front of a window that would fail, that would ultimately allow fire into the home or into the eaves and up into the attic space, or perhaps into the crawl space underneath the house. So that's the letter of the law. So when you have inspectors that come out, either from your local agency, perhaps CAL FIRE in the future, and most importantly, tied to the insurance industry, the 0 to 5 letter of the law says no flammable materials. So not only plants, but things that we accumulate around the house. So it only benefits you to reduce as much as you possibly can the available fuel in that 0 to 5 feet distance between the house. Letter of the law. And that's where I have to leave it, other than use your best judgment and understand that if an inspector says that something needs to come out, letter of the law, that needs to go.
Yeah. And we are right at 3:30. Marika, that was the last question. We've got to wrap up. We're bumping up against another meeting. We have to jump in, Fire Safe Sonoma. So I'm going to leave it there. Sorry, Allie, I can't grab that. Sorry, Susie, I can't grab those last few questions.
I just wanted to say, sorry, Roberta, that isn't that mostly in the very high fire hazard severity zones? It's not necessarily everywhere. Is it everywhere?
It's everywhere.
Okay, that's it. Thanks, Chief Nichols, for everything. Appreciate all you guys for joining us. Thanks very much for all you guys coming out. And don't forget, next year we'll be calling this series the Fire Safe Sonoma Speaker Series. You won't see us again until after the first of the year. So everybody, please have happy holidays, and we will see you in the new year. Thanks. Bye bye.